Thank you, everybody. We'll call the meeting back to order. The structure for the second half of our meeting will be 7 minutes for each particular party, starting off with Mr. Erskine-Smith.
Thanks very much. So I may not take the full 7 minutes, but we'll see. So you've talked about an objective reading of reasonably seen to be given to influence. So you talked about an objective interpretation of the definition reasonably seen to be given to influence. And is the testimony, and I think you said you took the Prime Minister at his word. And in reading your report, we have the Aga Khan state, in his written submissions, the Aga Khan described this invitation as an expression of the personal relationship between Mr. Trudeau and his family and the Aga Khan and his family, adding that he and his family have extended such standing invitations to a few close friends. And I wonder how that statement was used and or relied upon in your objective interpretation of reasonably seen to be given to influence.
Well, you know, I did note that there's quite a few people that got invited to the Aga Khan's Island in my report.
But a standing invitation, though, which he says
standing invitation,
which he extended to only a few close friends, according to his written testimony.
Yeah. You know, what can I really, it seems to me I've put out all the facts.
Sure.
I've put all the circumstances. The fact of the matter is, you know, these invitations resumed when the Prime Minister was in a position of power, either as a leader or as the Prime Minister. And I mean, I don't know. The facts are all there, and you make of them what you will.
Sure. And you didn't find that the Prime Minister acted to further the private interest of the Aga Khan in the course of your report?
No, I didn't find that he took any decision.
Right.
But he did take part in some discussions.
And in looking into recommendations that this committee might make in relation to the Conflict of Interest Act more generally, you've, not in your 2013 recommendations, but today you suggested perhaps removing the friend exception from the Act. Do you think that's preferable to setting out certain indicia in the Act of what a friend is?
I don't think you'd ever get a decent set of indicia on what
and
a friend
is there any worry? I mean, so with the definition reasonably seen to influence, I'll use an example of if a friend of mine gives me a gift on my birthday or Christmas, and they also happen to have be a registered lobbyist, and I'm a public office holder. Probably why the friend exception is there in the first place is to codify what a reasonable person might expect, which is when you get a gift from a friend in the ordinary course of that friendship, it's not seen to reasonably influence you.
Yeah, but you know, it seems to me you could say to your friend, look, you know, we got a situation here right now where you know, you're looking for something from my office, and so could we sort of desist with the gifts for a while?
Sure.
I mean, you know, or let's both pay for our lunch or whatever. Sure. It's if he's a good friend, for heaven's sake, why can't you say that to them?
So we can improve the Act and make it more stringent in the sense that by removing the friend exception and make it very clear to public office holders, while they are a public office holder.
Wouldn't make it, well, it would make it clear. I think it would just remove a bunch of confusion from it.
Sure. Which maybe led to this situation in the first place, that confusion.
Yeah, I think it might help.
Are there, you know, we have a motion that was previously approved to discuss your 2013 recommendations. We'll now have Mr. Dion before us to discuss potential recommendations of this committee with respect to the Conflict of Interest Act. Would you want to add anything in your testimony today, not specific to the Trudeau report, but specific to the recommendations we perhaps ought to make as a committee in relation to the Conflict of Interest Act more generally?
I'm sure I could probably dream up some. You know, those recommendations were made 5 years ago. And
so I guess the question is, would you? I mean, you've added the friend exception being removed in addition to your 2013 recs. Would you simply say otherwise you stand behind your 2013 recommendations?
By and large, yeah.
And there's no other additional recommendations you would make?
I'm sure there are some, because you know, every year when I do an annual report, I probably got recommendations that are not listed in that 5-year thing. I've made recommendations over the years and this is a new one, just take friend out. I mean, I haven't got that in any annual report, and I won't get to do another annual report. But so that's not the only source of my recommendations is not this 5-year review.
Okay. And we can ask the analysts to pull out any recommendations from the annual reports, but if you do think of other recommendations you would want this committee to review and consider in the course of our study of the Conflict of Interest Act, would you submit those in writing so we don't further waste your time as former commissioner?
Yeah, but I mean, I won't submit them in writing unless I know you want to hear from me, or you're going to
no,
look at them or
we certainly do. I
something.
mean, we've adopted a motion that says we want to hear from you, so we certainly do want to hear from you, and we will want to hear from Mr. Dion. But the fact of the matter is, there's yourself and there's Mr. Dion, who's just taken the role.
Yeah.
And with your experience, I think it would be very useful for this committee to understand what
Yeah.
reflections you would have and what changes we have to make.
Yeah.
My last question is just in relation to, we'd started to explore this idea of world leaders, and you'd indicated that the Pope was the closest thing to the Aga Khan as in terms of an analogy. And if the Pope and I think the Vatican Council in April is hosting a conference, and one of the items on that conference is healthy eating, okay? And if they invite is healthy eating. And promoting healthy eating around the world.
Okay.
And so if they invite world leaders and they say, we'll pay for you to stay at our for the purpose of the conference, and we're pushing you to spend money on healthy eating strategies globally and in your domestic countries. Is there a concern about accepting the gift of staying at the residence or the hotel or whatever the case
There's
might
a
be?
difference. If a gift is broadly offered, then it's usually not a problem.
Okay.
I've got lots of examples of that I've looked at over the years, where you invite all the MPs to something or other, it's fine. But if you target some of them, another thing I want to say is people are always talking about lobbyists. The act that I administered doesn't focus on lobbyists.
Sure.
It focuses on stakeholders.
Sure.
And they're a much broader group than a lobbyist. So just remember that just because you're not a lobbyist doesn't mean you're not necessarily caught.
And the simplest answer for us as politicians and for public office holders is to make sure we confirm in writing with the Ethics Commissioner in advance of undertaking any action or accepting any gift to ensure that we're compliant with the law.
Well, I mean, if you've got doubt, yeah, or you phone up and talk to an advisor and just talk it through.
Thanks very much.
I mean,
Thank
usually
you,
it's
Mr.
pretty.
Erskine-Smith. Next up for 7 minutes, Peter Kent.
Thank you, Chair. And your last answer provides a nice segue into my next question, which is, in the addendum to your report and your list of witnesses, you included a written submission from the Aga Khan and 4 other representatives of Aga Khan organizations or the Ismaili Council for Canada. And with regards to lobbyists, you've noted before that lobbyists used to be covered by the conflict of interest protocols and so forth. And you have noted, as you did today, that public office holders are defined in quite a different way than under the Ethics Commission of the Conflict of Interest Act and under lobbying.
Oh yeah, those things should sure be. Well, I don't know. It's very confusing because of the terms. Yeah.
And you are on record as saying that the only person the lobbyist commissioner is concerned about is the lobbyist. You're
right.
concerned with both sides.
Yeah.
And you've recommended in the past that, in fact, you believe the two offices should be joined one way or the other. And I'm wondering, because of the exceptional circumstances in this case, whether there is yet work to be done by the lobbyist commissioner with regards to the other side of the Trudeau report.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak for the lobbying commissioner, but I think it used to, as you say, it used to be the Lobbying Act, lobbying rules used to be under the conflict of interest regime, and there's certainly a good rationale for putting them together. The thing that's different, the thing that's kind of unusual about the Lobbying Act is the power for the lobbying commissioner to establish some rules That's not usual with somebody that is administering an act. I mean, I don't establish any of the rules that I'm administering. I just interpret them and apply them. So I find that an unusual power for the commissioner to be able to establish the rules. But so, you know, my feeling on whether the two should go together is it depends on the extent of the because there's nothing that necessitates them being connected, you know, consistent with each other. And there's terminology used under the lobbying regime, which is the same as what's used under my former regime, that mean different things. It's very confusing. I think reporting, I don't know, there's a number of terms there. I'd have to dig them out. So care needs to be given, I think, to make sure that, and it's the same with the difference that I mentioned between the code and the act.
Yes.
You know, and in the code, by the way, it must have been with the recommendations on the code, but I did a whole bunch of, it's not organized very well. I did a bunch of drafts because I'm a former drafter of all things. And so I actually did a number of drafts as to how that the code could be better presented. And, you know, there's lots of technical improvements that could be made in these things, but none of them are earth-shaking, you know.
So just to come back, do you believe there's any loose ends as the result of the Trudeau report that are beyond your purview that would be better considered by the lobbying commissioner?
No, I mean, I not per se. I think no, I haven't thought that. I haven't thought that through.
Okay.
Yeah.
In the past, you've also suggested that some of the considerations of friends and associates, that it be broadened, the Conflict of Interest Act be broadened in terms of who is covered. I would assume that would be among your continuing list of recommendations for Parliament for.
You mean who's covered by the?
Yes, who's covered?
By what? By which
the code,
rule?
Well, the code and the act, in terms of friends and.
Oh no, I was talking about relatives and.
Yes.
Yeah, sorry, the relatives and the family. There's
Relatives
different
and family,
terminology.
yes.
Yeah, and that it's worth looking at. I mean, I mentioned that I think in one of my recommendations under the code as well. I mean, I was very pleased that at the end of the last government, a number of amendments were made under the code. For example, they went from the 500 limit for reporting gifts to the 200, and there was a number of good changes that were made. But there was still a whole bunch of ones under the code that had been recommended that weren't looked at, particularly the technical ones.
Right. Now, your 2013 recommendations that were presented to government. It was quite a long list. I believe there were.
Oh, I think it's 87 or something.
Yes, yeah.
Masses.
And if you were to boil that down today or revisit that today in terms of recommendations, would they be the same list? For example, I think that the recommendation or the advice to close the ministerial loophole between divesting and blind trusts was in there, but it wasn't at the top of your list. I'm wondering if you would reshuffle your priorities.
Oh, I think that one has captured people's attention, and it
has now.
And why not?
Yes.
You know, just to explain why I didn't go beyond what the well. First of all, I had recommended the amendment be made in 2013. So then, how can I start interpreting it a different way?
Yes.
A, B. In making my decision on how to interpret that, I looked at masses of other legislation, parallel legislation, either in other jurisdictions or federally in the financial type legislation. And almost to an act, it says direct or indirect. And in my act, it said just nothing. And so you have to interpret that by looking at all the other uses in the legislation. And so that was the rationale behind that interpretation. But I've always felt, but you know, there's masses of things I could say about that area. Yes. Because there's much controversy among certain circles as to whether conflict of interest screens are appropriate. And conflict of interest screens are an additional mechanism to cover situations that aren't covered well by divestment. And I've got recommendations relating to divestment that go to. I think it's overly broad for some people. Like it matters that if you've got controlled assets in many, many situations, it matters, and you should get rid of them, but put them in a trust. But in some cases, if somebody has a job and is a public office holder that has nothing whatsoever to do with, they'd never have a power that they could do with respect to the particular holding they have. Sometimes that's a bit draconian for somebody to. Some people like to manage their financial affairs, and I think there should be a conflict test for certain levels of people in there. There's lots of interesting things in that area that could be fixed.
Thank you, Mr. Kent. Next up, for 7 minutes, Mr. Cullen.
Can I stay with that for a moment? A conflict test. Because, sure, there might be a public office holder who has no influence on a certain field where they may own some assets. But as you move up the chain of influence...
Precisely. Every time you change your position, you have to reassess.
Well, particularly if you move up to places like Prime Minister,
sure.
Cabinet Minister, the field of influence you have grows dramatically.
Yeah.
Therefore, you would imagine the measures people would have to take if they want to have that job should also grow. With great power comes that great responsibility.
Right.
So to be clear, this loophole that exists, I don't know what you want to call, I'll call it a loophole or an escape clause that says if something is directly controlled, here are all the rules that guide an office holder, a cabinet minister.
Yeah.
But if it's indirect, if it's in a numbered company, if it's...
Then we look for other measures.
That makes no sense, does it?
No, I know. I'm recommending that they get rid of that distinction.
Yeah, let's do that.
But whether or not that distinction, even if the distinction is gotten rid of, if you own 100% of your assets in one entity and you put it in a blind trust, what do you suppose is in your blind trust?
Yeah.
You'd be
pretty stupid not to.
And so you need additional measures, and I've got the Act has the powers 29 and 30 to establish those additional, and that's what our office has done.
Just to step back, thank you. That's helpful. And as the committee pursues, I hope we pursue strengthening the Act because it needs some strengthening. Anything that has 70, 80, 89 recommendations from the watchdog sounds to me like an Act that could use...
some of them are tiddly little things, but some of them are really important.
Yeah, not all are equivalent, but just the sheer number should strike most Canadians. Because Canadians are going to look back at this and say, are the rules sufficient right now? In 2018, and to keep ethical behavior
but they're not bad. The fact of the matter is, compared to the rest of the world, we're pretty good. And the other thing is, the people are pretty good, generally. This stuff can get blown out of proportion. Generally, people want to do the right thing.
Sure, but the reason we have rules is for when people do the wrong thing.
We need the rules, and we need the rules, of course.
Yeah, and we need watchdogs not for the good people doing the good things.
No.
We need the watchdogs and the rules for people, even the good ones,
well, actually,
when they're
we need them for everybody
things.
So they know what the rules are.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah.
There's some people will say, look, I know I'm good, so I don't need to worry about these rules.
Yeah, no, you can't legislate out stupid. We've tried. I want to know about when the Prime Minister or the Prime Minister's office saw the findings, because you said they didn't see the conclusions until you reported it. Is that
That's right.
When were the findings? Because I'm looking through the findings. They're all pointing in one direction.
Yeah.
When were the findings shown to the Prime Minister's office?
When I showed them, when I showed the fact. Sorry, what do you mean by findings?
Well, you said
findings
this earlier.
I don't know what that term means.
Oh, excuse me.
There's the facts, and there's the analysis, and there's the conclusion.
When did you show the Prime Minister's office the facts that were going to be in your report?
Yeah, it'll say. I think it was in October.
October?
I think.
Okay. Yeah, findings of fact. Sorry, I said findings. Findings of fact is the full.
Yeah.
So the findings of fact, those pages from, in your report, part 2, 49 through 58.
Yeah, I list off the 4 sections in the front there
Right.
in my description.
Where the whole friend argument breaks down, for example, because as you said earlier, if the Aga Khan was by definition a friend, here's the problems. You've broken the act this way. If the Aga Khan is not determined to be a friend, you've broken the act this way.
Yeah.
So that was in October. Sometime in October.
Yeah, everything I've got in my facts is what Prime Minister saw.
In October.
And his lawyers saw in October.
The curious thing for me is that because we didn't have your report, we didn't have your facts, we just had this concern around this Aga Khan trip. When repeated questions were put to the Prime Minister, this argument about friend, friend, friend was still used. But anybody looking at those facts would know that whether you determined him to be a friend or not, he had still broken the act. It seems just it's not necessarily comment.
There wasn't much on the other side that got broken. I mean, there was 4 provisions, but actually one of them was Section 11.
Yeah.
14 was okay.
Yeah.
There was the recusal one, 21.
Yeah.
And then there was 6-1. No,
Yeah.
5. 5 is the one that was contravened. And that's sort of a general one that sort of flops along with the recusal. It's
Yeah.
kind of neither here nor there. It's sort of a general provision, like do the stuff right.
I found that Mr. Trudeau failed to meet the general duties set out in e-vacation on the island. Section 11, Mr. Trudeau contravened Section 12 when his family accepted the trip by the Aga Khan.
Yeah.
Section 21, Mr. Trudeau contravened Section 21 when he failed to recuse
Yeah.
himself from 2 discussions.
And then I deliberately put Section 12 in a
Yeah.
separate part because
Yeah.
all the facts that led up to it were different. I'll tell you one real challenge in
That
this.
seems like a big deal.
What?
That seems like a big deal.
What?
These contraventions of the Ethics Act for a sitting Prime Minister. You seem...
Well, they're contraventions, yeah.
A sitting Prime Minister didn't recuse himself from meetings he ought to. He took a trip he should never have taken. Even if he'd gone to you beforehand and said, should I take this trip, you would have said no.
I probably would have said no,
Okay.
depending on the amount of information I was given.
Right. Knowing the circumstances, a reasonable person...
If I knew everything I knew here, that's the advice I would give.
He contravened his own instruction to his own ministers on the helicopter,
Well,
which you found.
that's what I found.
I guess some of this is the specifics, of course.
Yeah.
But where I'm drawn to is the ethical choices and the lack of prudence from the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister's office for a trip to expose himself, I guess, is the concern, to ethical violations, and as you found, exposed himself to being influenced. And using the extraordinary power of a Prime Minister to exert that influence. I guess as I pull away from this and we look to the future as to how to improve all this, we can do what we can. But if the code is ask for forgiveness, not permission, it's a challenging thing for any watchdog to keep people on the ethical line.
The encouraging thing about it is that this particular circumstance is exposed and it explains the rules, and now they're noticed. Every time a report is done, it enhances the understanding of the rule.
Well, as my grandma used to say, never waste a good crisis.
Yeah,
If something shows up that causes you pain,
And
pay
that's
attention.
probably the best benefit of one of these reports, is that it enhances the understanding of the rules.
In your time up until last year, is it right to say you did about 253 investigations? Would that sound like a number?
Oh, I don't know. I think it was, yeah, I mean, there's many files that we open that we don't proceed to an investigation for, too. And
Is that made public?
in my report, I give the numbers and I give a general explanation
Not specific.
of what sort of thing it was. I don't release the names because I didn't feel that it was worthy of an investigation. But what I do is sometimes I take some time to look in, or did. Sorry, I'm talking in the
It's
present.
okay.
But I look into the circumstances behind it. Even if it comes from a private citizen or from the media, if I see it in the media, if somebody tells me about something, we would follow up and see whether we thought there was anything to it.
Thank you, Mr. Cullen.
Just one last one.
Yeah, you're close. That's actually a minute over, so
Oh,
I
my
give you lots
goodness.
of time.
Violation. Violation.
Yeah.
Contravention.
5 minutes. Next up to Mr. Gort.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Dawson, as you explained earlier, Okay?
Mana maybe, but not Michelle.
Yeah, just to clarify, there's the way it was written down in order was different than the typical structure. So yes, you're correct. We'll go up next to Monsieur Picard.
Désolé, on va encore avoir...
Sorry, I have 7 minutes. You made a comment with Mr. Cullen saying that this type of report allows people to better understand the rules. So this means that it's quite natural and normal there are rules that are subject to interpretation. There can be confusion, and in these type of situations, we can shed light on some aspects of these rules. So in this type of situation, in terms of ethics, there is some leeway in terms of interpretation. Did I understand your comment correctly? Yes. So it's unavoidable that with applying the rules that are in place, your office, like other parties that are involved in this event, they have to do their own interpretation, and to the best of their knowledge, they have to apply the rules in the best way that they deem adequate and in good faith, respecting the text of the Act. That is also how you understand the action of each party. They act in good faith and try to do everything impossible to respect the Act. In the first 5 or 10 minutes of your comments, opening remarks, you said that in this circumstance, the Prime Minister did very quickly offer an apology. And in your opinion, given this, it was the right thing to do, and the only thing that was to do. Now that the report is out, we better understand the details of this specific event, and we can move forward, and there's no other consequences or events that should follow the publication of your report. Did I understand this correctly? Yes. So the type of report you published will it serve as a reminder? Yes, everyone has to, out of caution, for the sake of caution, ask or submit questions to the Commissioner's office in order to avoid, even if it's obvious, confusion, to make sure everyone's on the safe side, without necessarily increasing the work of your office, because I know there are also some personal requests. In your opinion, does this report set out that there is also an in-depth revision of the Act that is necessary? No.
Made to date, and the ones that I've made, I don't think this report is a seminal change in the way we see the legislation. It's a specific case that was interpreted under the rules that are in the Act, but I don't think anything new or much new flows from it.
La nature de notre travail comme député.
As a member, when we consider ethics regulations, it's as if overnight, I'm exaggerating perhaps, it's if we no longer have a life. We can no longer talk to people we know in the same way. And now, when we meet with a friend, as soon as something's mentioned about our work, we have to say, sorry, I'll have to bill you if you want us to talk about this, because what we're talking about exceeds the boundaries of our friendship. The challenge for you is to look at things on a case-by-case basis, and there's a subjective interpretation of the facts that are put forth, and as MPs, there's a challenge for us. We can't talk to you anymore for fear that our common conversation could change into something compromising, and we could be criticized for this meeting.
Many guidelines that we've put out, advisories, guidelines, and we see problems. We have tried to give advice in a general way and to be as specific as we can. But there is a balance there. Sometimes you don't foresee the thing that's going to come up, and you haven't examined every single instance that could happen. But believe me, and just another thing while I'm here, again under the code, the office does not have the power to establish guidelines without going through the Procedures Committee. This is the wrong committee to be telling this to. But I have said many times that they should allow the Conflict of Interest Office to do guidelines without having to go through the Procedures Committee. The Procedures Committee can always negate them after the fact or something, but the trouble is I've actually sent gift guidelines into the Procedures Committee and a couple of years ago, and nobody ever responded. And the other thing that's silly is the forms have to be put through the Procedures Committee. Again, I'm talking to the wrong committee, but I don't have a form in front of the. Yeah, and so there's too much. There's no way I can put proper guidelines out under the code. So what I say to people under the code is go and read the guidelines under the Act. They're sort of the same. Anyway, sorry, but I mean we have done quite a focus on promulgating guidelines so people do know what the rules are. But there's no way that you can cover every instance in your guidelines.
Quelle est la marge de manœuvre d'interprétation ou de?
What leeway is there in terms of interpretation or reasonability that you give to MPs? Because MPs face circumstances when things come up, and they have to act consequently when circumstances change. There are a lot of guidelines and orientation, but we have to respect the Commissioner's office. At the same time, I imagine your office has to assume that the MP, whoever they are, is able to use their good judgment when circumstances change during an event. And this can be at an exceptional dimension or a particular something that comes up that wasn't foreseen. And we look at the results, and the MPs, regardless of who they are and what their responsibility is, have to be able to evaluate the situation, and they have to evaluate what the right thing to do is. So what leeway is there? What latitude do you give them?
Bringing the matters forward. And the other thing is we've always offered to every caucus a session every year. Anyway, I don't know what else I can say.
Thank you. Merci. Merci, Mr. President.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Picard. Next up, 5 minutes to Mr. Picard.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Madame.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Dawson, during the first trip that Mr. Trudeau took in 2014, he was invited as leader of the Liberal Party of Canada. He was that leader at the time in 2014 during his first trip. The second trip, Mr. Trudeau was invited as a prime minister in 2016. And this was in his role as prime minister. So Aga Khan invited the head of the Liberal Party first, and he also invited the prime minister during his second trip. if Marc Garneau had won the leadership race, he did not receive an invitation. It was Mr. Trudeau. I never received an invitation from Aga Khan. So Aga Khan obviously is inviting high officials to his country, to a country. So, Ms. Dawson, the discussions that took place with Mr. Aga Khan do not mean that Mr. Trudeau is not responsible in terms of the Aga Khan Foundation. Everything is linked. Even though the Prime Minister says that I'm not in charge of this foundation, etc., perhaps he's not personally in charge of this, but he's still responsible for giving the money of Canadians to this foundation. And unfortunately, in this whole story, why does he get off? Because you said in the report it wasn't his responsibility. He wasn't in charge of this. But since this file has hit the media for the past year, I know from experience that this type of file, and we start asking the Prime Minister questions in the House on this, we get an answer. And the Prime Minister has to know this file off heart to be able to answer any possible questions that come up. So it becomes the PM's and his office, their responsibility. So why did you say that he shouldn't be in charge of this? It would be important for him to take care of this. Why did you take his responsibility away from all the files of the Aga Khan Foundation?
I said it wasn't his responsibility. I'm missing the point here. I'm sorry. Maybe I'm getting tired. Maybe if I listen to it in English or something. Or try again.
Non, pas de problème. Vous avez dit que...
You said that the Prime Minister did not take part in any decision-making with regard to Aga Khan and his institutions. I know that the Prime Minister personally was not in charge of this file, but he's still responsible for this, given all the media saga that was around this file. And it did end up on his desk. So he had to answer questions at question period. He was asked a lot of questions. So we can't just get off the hook from this file with regard to the money that was paid to the Aga Khan Foundation. This can't be the case, since this foundation is registered as a lobbying foundation in Canada.
Vous avez demandé au Premier ministre...
You said in your report that the Prime Minister did not participate in any decision-making or took any positions with regarding this Aga Khan Foundation. Yes, that's true. But the Prime Minister was invited because he was the Prime Minister, not because he was Justin Trudeau. No. So Aga Khan obviously talked about future events, what Canada would pay the foundation, or any other conversations that we'll never really know about. But Mr. Trudeau can't shirk the responsibility that he has.
He has to actually take part in making the decision, if that's what you're talking about, for him to be found to have contravened the decision-making. But the distinction in the two circumstances were, in one case, he took part in a discussion and had the capacity to have an effect on it. It's the words are have an opportunity to affect, and he should recuse himself from that. But in fact, I found that he did not make any decision. There was two. I don't know if I'm answering your question at all, but there's two different overlays there. One is making the decision, and one is participating in the discussion and having the opportunity to affect the outcome.
Thank you, Ms. Shigord. Last up, we're down to about 3 minutes left, will be Mr. Erskine-Smith.
So first, I want to say thank you for coming for 2 hours. It's rare we have a witness for 2 hours, and I appreciate your time. I just have two questions specific to our study of the Act more generally. So one is you recommended that Section 17 be amended to cover cases where controlled assets are held indirectly as well as directly. That seems an obvious change. We have a rule in the House of Commons, one cannot do something indirectly that one cannot do directly. You said that should be top of our list. I think that's right. Are there other recommendations in that 75 recommendation report from 2013 that you would say should be top of our list? And if nothing jumps out, you can.
There were
you can send us a note.
5 or 6, and I've stated them on a number of occasions, and you think I can remember them right now. I think if I had the list in front of me,
That's
I'd have
okay.
them. There's
You can-
5 or 6 of them that I've identified not too long ago.
We'll look for that. I think it might be in your
Yeah.
in the executive summary there. And the second question I would have is just the de minimis. And so I give an example. When we first got elected, I don't know if it happened for Conservative or NDP MPs, but every Liberal MP got a gram of marijuana from pot activist Dana Larson. And I think you had recommended that it be returned on the basis that it might be reasonably seen to influence us. That strikes me as a de minimis. It's $10 or less. And do you think there's a concern that we get into the $10 or less amounts that we're distracting from the bigger problems? And should there be a de minimis consideration there?
I've kind of, I think, established a notional de minimis of about $35.
Okay.
I've done that somewhere.
Okay.
And, yeah.
And with that, I give the remainder of my time for Mr. Fergus. I know he's got
I think
a
there
couple
was a criminality to that one, which I think colored it. It was
Hopefully
a different
soon
situation.
goes away, but that's right.
Yeah, I said, yeah. In fact, I think I phoned the speaker or somebody, I think, and said, look,
Mr.
there's
Biddle.
a criminality in this one. Get rid of it. I did.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Mr. Biddle's got
Send it back, Nathaniel.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'd like to narrow down, you talked about the Prime Minister receiving facts from the report in October. Are you certain of that time frame, and can you be specific or provide the committee?
I think I've got the date in the report. When I think maybe it's in the process. I don't know. I'm sure it was somewhere in the middle of October. I mean, we can find that for you easy enough. But
And to clarify, it's the facts section, not your conclusions,
no. And I think it's probably described in the process right up at the front. Somewhere I think that date was mentioned.
Just for the sake of for the
Process.
committee, we'll just extend just by a few minutes just to allow some paper turning. And okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Anyway, it was mid-October.
Okay. Thank you. That's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Biddle. I just have one last, Mr.
Well,
Gibbs.
thank you, Chair, and thank you, Ms. Dawson, for appearing before us today. But, Chair, I believe that in light of the testimony from former Commissioner Dawson given openly and generously today, and given that I believe there's still an abundance of unanswered questions that one can draw from the Trudeau report, I respectfully propose to this committee the following motion, or a version of this, that the committee invite the Prime Minister to discuss the findings of the Ethics Commissioner contained in the Trudeau report released in December, as well as questions drawn from the report and from testimony from the former Commissioner before this committee today.
So can you just repeat that motion one more time just for the clerk and I?
That the committee, and you can correct this grammatically as you will, that the committee invite the Prime Minister to discuss the finding of the Ethics Commissioner contained in the Trudeau report released in December, as well as questions drawn from her additional testimony before committee today on this date.
Just give us a few minutes.
Sure.
So, yeah, so just to deal with the motion, I've heard different comments that it's the same as it was yesterday. And some are saying, as Mr. Kent is, that it's different. And the part that I see as different is that it references Ms. Dawson's testimony this very day. And I see that as a different motion. So we will discuss the motion as it is before us. Mr. Fergus.
All right, thank you very much. I'm not a regular member of this committee, and I would not wish to put up my foot in the wrong place, but it would strike me that, as we talked about in testimony today, that we're just really doing indirectly what we couldn't do directly. It strikes me that the substance of the motion is exactly the same as what was presented yesterday, although there are some different words, but the effect is the same. And the intention seems to be largely the same, and it was considered by the committee before.
Yeah, and thank you, Mr. Fergus, for that. I was discussing with the clerk just now that very point, and again, due to the difference that it references the testimony of the former commissioner before us today, I see it as different. It's similar, but it is different. We have Mr. Cullen to speak next.
Yeah, I think what would be obviously different is the 2 hours of testimony we've just had from the commissioner who investigated this and wrote the report that we referred to yesterday. I too join Mr. Kent in thanking Ms. Dawson for her testimony today. 2 hours is unusual. To my, I don't know if it was. I didn't put. I don't think the record. I don't think Hansard will show that I said cruel. I hope that our treatment was fair and tough but fair. The notion, obviously, I voted for this motion, a similar motion yesterday. I don't need convincing, because I think the opportunity for the Prime Minister to come forward and answer some of the questions that Ms. Dawson can't answer because she didn't make the decisions that pertain to the 4 contraventions of the Act. The Prime Minister did. In his explanation at that press conference is where I've seen it, and there was a question, I think, put to him in his town hall last night, which in both cases, if you look at the record, they're non-answers. They're avoiding. They go back to the friend argument, actually, which today I think was a very important and incisive thing for me, that the entire, one of the main pieces of the Prime Minister's defense of this particular decision, and even since following Ms. Dawson's report in that same press conference, was the utterance of friend, 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 as if that would have made it better. What I learned today, and I hope my Liberal colleagues learned today, is that the aspect of the friendship would have in fact not made it better. It would have been a different contravention of the Ethics Act. That's all. So he would have broken the rules, but in a novel and different way. But rules would have still been broken. So obviously, I am more in favor of the idea of the Prime Minister coming based upon what I learned and what I still don't know. The appeal, similar to yesterday, but now enhanced because of Ms. Dawson's testimony, would be my Liberal colleagues not to vote as a bloc to suggest that the Prime Minister shouldn't testify. That open and accountable government, I think, is the name of the cabinet directive, would mean open and accountable government, which would be right here. The questions that remain outstanding are, does the Prime Minister still rely on this as a friendship situation in which it was just a gift? We don't know, and I asked Ms. Dawson this very specifically, and it was not important to her, and I respect that. It's important to me. Who asked for the trip? Was the trip offered or was the trip requested? Motivation is important when you're dealing with conflicts of interest. If a member of Parliament, I don't gesture towards you, Chair, but if a member of Parliament were to go out and solicit a gift, is very different, maybe not in the final conclusion, but it is different than somebody offering a gift. The fact that the gift in this case, whether solicited or offered, would have broken the Ethics Act is just an additive, not a subtractive. So for me, the other questions that remain and in doubt is that the Prime Minister says he learned from this, he's admitted it was a mistake, but I don't actually know what specific steps his office has taken to not allow for this to happen again. I don't know if there's other circumstances in which this similar or same thing has taken place. And lastly, and I'll end on this, Chair, I heard from Mr. Erskine-Smith in his last question to Ms. Dawson about improvements to the Act. All I've heard the Prime Minister say to this point, and his opinion matters on this, clearly with a majority government, is a firm commitment that this Parliament will fix these loopholes and these problems within our ethics code so that future Prime Ministers, Cabinet Ministers, MPs, doesn't matter, cannot exploit the same or attempt to exploit the same loopholes that exist within our ethics law. Until I hear the Prime Minister actually say that, and I'd love to ask him that question, and the 35-second exchange in question period has proven to this point insufficient in drawing out the Prime Minister's true feelings about not only this trip, but the need to improve our ethics code in this Parliament, and a contravention of his own directive to his own cabinet ministers, and the fact that I assume there's consequences to breaking his rules, but there appear to be no consequences for him if he broke those rules. These seem to be substantive and real questions, and I hope committee members would have seen today that in the conversation with Ms. Dawson, this was both substantive and respectful in the way that we approach these questions, because my respect for the Prime Minister's office is such that having a Prime Minister come before us would merit and guarantee that same level of respect for him and his testimony. So I hope my Liberal friends are not only encouraged, but remain with the same questions or similar questions that I have that can only and ultimately be answered by the Prime Minister, and not in 35-second prepared sound bites in question period, but in a substantive conversation like the one we've had here today.
Thank you, Mr. Cullen. Any further discussion on the motion today? We'll call the vote.
Recorded vote.
Recorded then.
So on the motion, Mr. Erskine-Smith,
No.
Mr. Saini,
No.
Monsieur Fergus,
Je vote contre.
Madame Fortier,
Non.
Mr. Biddle,
No.
Monsieur Picard,
Non.
Mr. Kent,
Yes.
Mr. Gould,
Oui.
Mr. Cullen.
Yes.
So the motion fails 6-3. We are adjourned. Thanks again, Ms. Dawson, for coming.